Hi history lovers, and welcome back to the channel where I bring you new videos every week on all aspects of the past. For today's deep dive into the mists of time, we're going to examine the history of the Koh-i-Nur diamond. One of the centerpiece stones of the British crown jewels, its name means Mountain of Light in Persian, and it is arguably the most famous diamond in the world. What's more, it has had a roller coaster ride through history. I'll be telling you about its mythical origins, the rather fishy circumstances under which it made its way from an 11-year-old Maharaja in Lahore to Queen Victoria in England, and the supposed curse it carries, which makes wearing it a life-threatening undertaking if you're a man. Stay till the end and I'll give you an update on India's ongoing attempts to get the stone and why its use in British coronations is so controversial. First things first, the diamond goes under a few different names and spellings, including Kohinoor and Koh-i-nur. All are perfectly acceptable as far as I'm concerned, but I'll be sticking with Koh-i-nur for simplicity's sake. Speaking of pronunciations, I'll need to say a lot of what are, to me, foreign language words in this video, and I'm sure I'm going to get some of them wrong, so please go easy on me in the comments. I'm doing my incompetent best here, I promise. The diamond's origins are shrouded in mystery and legend. It comes from India, as almost all diamonds found prior to 1725 did, for it wasn't until that year that the Brazilian diamond mines were discovered. And according to a fun but fantastical myth, between 3,000 and 6,000 years ago, a stone known as the Syamantaka jewel was given to King Sandrajit of Dwarka by the deity Surya. Then, having been lost to Jambavin, king of the bears, it was recovered by one of Sandrajit's subjects named Krishna. The stone then caused more havoc as the years rolled by, as it was stolen and recovered, with much blood being shed in the process. There is no reliable evidence that this stone was real, or that it was the Koh-i-nur, but the two have long been associated with one another in Indian legend. Moving forward in time to the year 1526 AD, we meet Zahir-ud-din Babur, a Turco-Mongol prince from what is now Uzbekistan, who in that year defeated the Sultan of Delhi and founded the Mughal Empire. Now what's important about Babur is that he also kept a diary, and in it he referenced a fabulous diamond which is thought by some to be the Koh-i-nur. So let's take a look at this source and see what it says. For context, we are still in 1526, and Babur's son, Humayun, has just defeated Bikramjit, the Raja of Gwalior, which is both a district and a city in India. The family of the defeated Raja were then in the city of Agra, and according to Babur, when Humayun reached Agra, they must have been planning to flee, but his postings of men to watch the roads prevented this, and guard was kept over them. Humayun himself did not let them go. They made him a voluntary offering of a mass of jewels and valuables, amongst which was the famous diamond which Alai-ud-din, this was a sultan of Delhi who reigned in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, must have brought. Its reputation is that every appraiser has estimated its value at 2.5 days' food for the whole world. Apparently it weighs 8 miskals. Humayun offered it to me when I arrived at Agra. I just gave it him back. As you can see, this description is very light on details, and I'm afraid the diamond that Humayun obtained, though undoubtedly impressive, cannot really be connected to the Koh-i-nur. Writing in the Journal of the British Institute of Persian Studies, historian Anna Maleka has contended that the stone's weight, once converted into modern carats, was about 150 to 160 carats, whereas the Koh-i-nur was 191.03 carats until the 1850s, and we'll get to what happened to it in that decade in a few minutes. Obviously, it cannot have grown in size in the intervening years, and so this discrepancy rules out Babur/Humayun stone as being the Koh-i-nur. On top of this, the Koh-i-nur prior to the 1850s was cut in a fashion known as the Mughal cut, which you see in this image, but which was not used in India yet in 1526. Finally, records from the gem's confirmed history tell us that it had obvious flaws prior to its recutting in the 1850s, yet no such flaws are mentioned in the discussion of Babur's diamond. Admittedly, this is just circumstantial, as flaws wouldn't necessarily have been mentioned in descriptions of that stone. This all seems pretty conclusive, but I'd like to add that other writers dispute how much the Babur stone of 1526 really weighed, as converting old measurement systems into new is often very difficult, so there's still an outside chance that the two stones are one and the same. Babur died in 1530 and the stone went to Humayun. He then gave it to the leader of Iran in 1544, and 3 years later he sent it to the ruler of Ahmadnagar in the Deccan, which is in the south of India, though whether or not it arrived is unclear, and that is the last we hear of it. We now come to the 17th century. In 1635, Emperor Shah Jahan, ruler of the Mughal Empire in India, celebrated the completion of the famous peacock throne, upon which rulers of this empire would sit, and which we know for sure would later house the Koh-i-nur. Incidentally, I believe it's called the peacock throne because of the decorative peacocks on top of it. We don't know when the stone was placed in this elaborate chair, however, and it is for this reason that accounts of some of the incredible diamonds associated with the Mughal Empire have sometimes been associated with it too. In particular, the writings of a French diamond dealer named Jean-Baptiste Tavernier are often cited as references to this erstwhile diamond. In early November 1665, during the reign of Emperor Aurangzeb, who was Shah Jahan's son and who had deposed his father and placed him under house arrest, Tavernier was finishing up a visit to India when he was allowed to see the emperor's jewel collection. He tells us that the first piece which Akil Khan, that's the jewel keeper, put into my hands was the great diamond, which is a round rose cut very high on one side. This is a reference to the style in which it had been cut. On the lower edge there is a slight crack and a little flaw in it. Its water is beautiful, and it weighs 319.5 ratis, which make 280 of our carats, the ratis being 7/8 of our carat. When Murgamula, i.e. Emir Jamla, who betrayed the king of Golconda, his master, made present of this stone to Shah Jahan, to whose court he retired, it was rough, and weighed then 900 ratis, which makes 787.5 carats, and there were several flaws in it. Tavernier called this diamond the Great Mughal, and he claimed that it was given to Shah Jahan in about 1656. His accounts of it are confusing though, as elsewhere in his book he gives different weights for it than those just listed. He also added that this stone is of the same form as if one cut an egg through the middle. As William Dalrymple and Anita Anand tell us, their book on the Koh-i-nur is linked in the description box, during the 19th century there was a commonly held belief that this Great Mughal and the Koh-i-nur were one and the same. Nowadays, however, the diamond Tavernier saw is thought to be the Orlov diamond, which resides in Russia and is named after one of Catherine the Great's favourites, and it does indeed look like the image Tavernier drew of the Great Mughal, as you see here. Furthermore, a 2008 article in the journal Gems and Gemology discussed the use of computer modelling to show that the Koh-i-nur could not have been cut from the Great Mughal as drawn by Tavernier because the dimensions do not work, one simply would not fit inside the other. Dalrymple and Anand speculate that the actual Koh-i-nur may not have been presented to Tavernier in 1665 because it was already part of the peacock throne, or because it was still in the possession of the deposed Shah Jahan, who didn't die until 1666, but we'll never know for sure. In fact, everything I've told you so far about the stone's history is nothing but myth and conjecture, and if the Babur stone, the Great Mughal and the Koh-i-nur are all the same diamond, then this fact remains impossible to satisfactorily prove, and its passage from the Deccan back into Mughal hands in India is still murky. It is only in 1739 that we get our first definite look at the Koh-i-nur, and that its confirmed provenance begins. In that year, the Mughal Empire, which was by then under the control of Emperor Muhammad Shah Rangila, fell to the forces of Nadir Shah, who was the leader of Persia, aka modern-day Iran. Upon seeing the stone for the first time, Nadir supposedly gave it its name by proclaiming Koh-i-nur, meaning Mountain of Light, as I've already explained, then took it as part of the peacock throne, which you can see him sitting on here, to Afghanistan. However, within a few years, he ended up basically going insane with paranoia and was eventually assassinated in 1747. At that point, the Koh-i-nur, which had by now been extracted from the peacock throne, landed in the hands of his bodyguard, Ahmed Shah Abdali, also called Ahmed Shah Durrani. He was soon proclaimed king of the Afghans and took the diamond to Afghanistan, where it stayed with him and his descendants for nearly 70 years. By the turn of the 19th century, it was in the possession of his grandson Shah Zaman, who was taken prisoner and blinded by a chieftain called Ashik Sinwari in 1800, but not before he managed to hide the Koh-i-nur in the wall of his cell. His younger brother, Shah Shuja, took over as leader and in 1803 enacted a terrible revenge on those who had mutilated his sibling. He had Ashik's mouth filled with gunpowder, then blew him up, had his followers tortured into insanity, and his wife and children fired from cannons. It's these kinds of stories which would later feed into the so-called curse of the Koh-i-nur, which we'll come to in a few minutes. The diamond itself was recovered after a search from an unsuspecting man who was using it as a paperweight, and in 1808 a representative of the East India Company, a Scottish man by the name of Mountstuart Elphinstone, reported seeing Shah Shuja wearing it on an armband or bracelet. I'm just going to pause for a moment to briefly explain what the East India Company was for those of you who are unfamiliar with it, as it's going to feature again a little later in our story. This was a huge British trading company which existed for over 250 years and which operated in many parts of the world, but primarily in the Indian Ocean region. At certain stages of its existence, it had its own substantial army and even controlled huge swathes of India, and it's this control which would eventually bring it into contact with the Koh-i-nur. Back to Shah Shuja though. By 1809 he'd been overthrown, and 4 years later he found himself in exile in Lahore in Pakistan, having been released from a previous Kashmiri prison thanks to the intervention of the founder of the Sikh Empire, Maharaja Ranjit Singh, who ruled over the Punjab region. This encompasses parts of modern-day India and Pakistan. Singh demanded the diamond in exchange for his services, and according to his own memoirs, Shuja was unwilling to comply. However, further imprisonment, deprivations, and being forced to watch one of his sons being tortured finally broke him, and in exchange for money and a treaty of friendship and unity, he produced and handed over the diamond which had been in the care of his wife during his imprisonment. She apparently said of the stone that, if a strong man were to throw 4 stones, one north, one south, one east, one west, and a 5th stone up into the air, and if the space between them were to be filled with gold, all would not equal the value of the Koh-i-nur. Ranjit Singh held on to the diamond for the rest of his life, wearing it at most if not all state occasions and having it set sometimes in his turban and at others in an armband with 2 more diamonds on either side. After his death in 1839, there ensued a messy few years in which the throne changed hands several times, before it eventually went to his infant son, Duleep Singh, who became Maharaja in 1843 at the age of 5. 6 years and 2 Anglo-Sikh wars later, the British had annexed the Punjab region and taken control of the Lahore treasury. According to a book on precious stones written in 1856, quote, the civil authorities took possession of the Lahore treasury under the stipulation previously made that all the property of the state should be confiscated to the East India Company in part payment of the debt due by the Lahore government and of the expenses of the war, end quote. The 1849 Treaty of Lahore, and you can see the city here with Duleep's father Ranjit in the foreground, further stated that the gem called the Koh-i-nur, which was taken from Shah Shuja ul Mulk by Maharaja Ranjit Singh, shall be surrendered by the Maharaja of Lahore to the Queen of England. And that, history lovers, is exactly what happened. The Earl, soon to be Marquis of Dalhousie, who was then the British Governor-General of India, has left us a fascinating, though deeply problematic, diary entry in which he discussed the Koh-i-nur, along with its reputation at that point, what he felt it meant to those who possessed it, and why he believed he was justified in taking it, because take it he did. In the modern era, when colonisation and cultural appropriation are so heavily frowned upon, I think most of us will disagree with his reasoning, but his diary offers a valuable insight into the mindset of a mid-19th century British politician and his colonial attitudes. He wrote that, "The Koh-i-nur has ever been the symbol of conquest. The Emperor of Delhi had it in his peacock throne, while Shah Shuja ul Mulk was king, Ranjit Singh extorted the diamond by gross violence and cruelty. And now when, as the result of unprovoked war, the British government has conquered the kingdom of Punjab and has resolved to add it to the territories of the British Empire in India, I have a right to compel the Maharaja of Lahore, in token of his submission, to surrender the jewel to the Queen, that it may find its final and fitting resting place in the crown in Britain. For there is not one of those who have held it since its original possessor who can boast so just a title to its possession as the Queen of England can claim after 2 bloody and unprovoked wars. Guided by this attitude, Lord Dalhousie had the 11-year-old Duleep Singh, who had been removed from the custody of his mother and put in the care of a British couple, Sir John and Lena Lady Logan, officially surrender the diamond to him, after which he put it on a boat to England on the 6th of April 1850. It arrived at its destination on the 30th of June, and on the 3rd of July it was presented to Queen Victoria. This left a sour taste in the collective mouths of the East India Company, as they felt they owned the diamond and should have been the ones who got to gift it to the Queen. But Dalhousie was determined to get the credit, and as it happened, the East India Company was nationalised in 1858 anyway, and completely dissolved in 1874. The diamond had now entered the possession of the British royal family, and to date it hasn't left. The Koh-i-nur at this point weighed 191.03 modern carats and measured 40.85 by 32.57 by 16.18 millimetres. It had 169 facets. It was domed on one side and flat on the other, and was likely cut into this so-called Mughal shape in the 1530s, as that style of cutting only became popular in India, which is where the stone originated, remember, and where we're assuming it was at that point in time, at about that stage. This is the stone as it was when it was placed into Victoria's hands. Thanks to her husband, Prince Albert, however, it is not the stone we see today. Albert was very taken with the Koh-i-nur and its fascinating history, and determined to have it showcased to the public in the famous 1851 Great Exhibition, which took place in the now lost Crystal Palace, and which he had been heavily involved in planning. Victoria wore it to the exhibition's opening ceremony, after which the diamond was to be one of the highlights of the show. It and the 2 diamonds which had been on either side of it in its armband were removed and displayed inside a golden cage mounted on prongs as you see here, but unfortunately the viewing public found it rather underwhelming. The fact that it was lauded as the Mountain of Light placed some very high expectations on it, but English visitors were used to seeing diamonds which had been cut in what was then the modern European manner, which maximised their sparkle. The Koh-i-Noor's 16th century Eastern cut instead prioritised size over glitz, and it just wasn't as lustrous or as large as most had expected. The poor lighting it was under in the Crystal Palace didn't help either, nor did the fact that viewers had to look at it from a slight distance. One spectator had the following to say about it. Notwithstanding the enormous value at which it has been estimated, it has disappointed public expectation in no ordinary degree. The ungraceful peculiarity of its shape and the ineffective manner in which it has been cut, although more than half its weight has been wasted in the operation, I'm not sure where they got that detail from, but there's no reason to think it true, having deprived it of much of the brilliancy and beauty of which no doubt the original stone would, in skilful hands, have proved susceptible, and in spite of the various expedients that have been resorted to for the purpose of exhibiting it to the best advantage, it is still very far from realising the anticipations that had been formed of its attractions. Prince Albert was disappointed that it hadn't been more of a hit, and in 1852 he ordered that the stone be recut in order to improve its sparkle. The royal jewellers, Garrets, brought in cutters from Koster Diamonds in Amsterdam, who stated that the job could be completed with only a minimal loss of weight to the stone. This was utterly untrue. The first cut was made on the 16th of July by the famed 83-year-old Duke of Wellington, Victor of Waterloo. This was presumably a publicity stunt, which also meant that if the whole thing went awry, some of the blame could at least be put on him. After 38 days, the alterations were complete. The now oval-cut stone had lost 43% of its weight and now came in at 105.6 modern carats with 58 facets. Prince Albert was not amused with the outcome, but of course nothing could be done now. I also don't know what happened to the bits they cut off, by the way. Sorry. The main reason we know what it looked like before this change is that this glass copy as well as casts were taken of it before the cutting. Otherwise the stone's pre-1852 dimensions and exact cut may well have been lost to us forever. Now, if you've seen my video on another extremely famous diamond in the royal collection, the Cullinan, you'll know that cutting large stones into smaller ones so that they can be polished and worn is not an unusual practice. But in the case of the Koh-i-nur, which unlike the Cullinan was not in its original rough state and which already had a long and famous history, I have to say I don't think I would have done this to it just to make it suit 19th century European aesthetic preferences. I look forward to reading your thoughts on the matter in the comments though. Perhaps you think it was worth it. The diamond was now set into various pieces of jewellery for Victoria, who wore it, among other things, in a bracelet, a tiara, and the brooch you can see on her here. She was a little concerned about donning it though, for she had heard stories that it was cursed. This wasn't helped by the fact that on the 27th of June 1850, when the stone was on its way to her, she was assaulted by a man named Robert Pate, who hit her over the head while she was out in her carriage. In fact, as author Danielle Kinsey has shown, this curse originated in the 1850s, just as the stone was being taken to England, and may have been started by the Delhi Gazette newspaper, then taken up by the Illustrated London News. When Lord Dalhousie heard about the rumours and that he was being blamed for the attack on the Queen for having sent her the jewel, even though it hadn't actually arrived in England yet at the time of the Pate attack, he quickly moved to quash any suggestion of an ancient curse, telling a correspondent in September 1850 that, "Without going back to the first emperor who held it, I would observe that Nadir Shah, who took it, was usually reckoned well-to-do in the world throughout his life," this obviously overlooks his unpleasant death, "and that Runjeet Singh, who also took it, and became, from the son of a petty zamindar, which is a kind of landowner, the most powerful native prince in India, and lived and died the power most formidable to England, and her best friend, has usually been thought to have prospered tolerably. As for tradition, when Shah Shuja, from whom it was taken, was afterwards asked by Runjeet's desire what was the value of the Koh-i-nur, he replied, 'Its value is good fortune, for whoever possesses it has been superior to all his enemies.' I sent the Queen a narrative of this conversation with Shah Shuja, taken from the mouth of the messenger." In 1858, he wrote another letter in which he reiterated many of these points, adding that he had only seen the rumour written about in an English newspaper, that it had no basis in Indian histories of the diamond, and concluding that, "If Her Majesty thinks it brings bad luck, let her give it back to me. I will take it and its ill luck on speculation." The curse was therefore only born in the mid-19th century, and as Dalhousie correctly pointed out, plenty of men had owned it without suffering any overt bad luck, at least not by the standards of the day. We can also see how this pseudo-curse has evolved. Nowadays, it is said to be unlucky for men to wear the diamond, but in 1850 that detail hadn't been dreamt up yet, and Queen Victoria herself was supposed to have suffered from it, even when it was not yet in her possession. In short, we can discard any notion that this stone comes with bad fortune. It's a tale invented to make the diamond even more interesting, and while bad things certainly happened to some of its owners, that was largely because of their own greed in trying to acquire it, and because of the era and area in which they lived, when blinding political opponents and doling out horrible executions was considered normal. For another similar story of an imaginary curse on a famous gemstone, see my video on the Hope diamond, linked on screen and below for you. Let's return now to the young Maharaja Duleep Singh, whose story continued to be interlaced with the Koh-i-Noors. Having been placed in the care of the Protestant John and Lena Logan, he soon converted to that religion, and by the early 1850s was expressing a desire to travel to England, a wish which was granted in 1854. Queen Victoria was quite taken with him and decided to show him his former diamond, now cut to nearly half the size it had been when he last saw it. Lena Logan recounted the incident, saying that all present endured an excruciatingly awkward 45 minutes, during which the teenage Maharaja stood looking at what had been his diamond just a few years earlier, before turning to Victoria and, quote, As if summoning up his resolution after a profound struggle, and with a deep sigh, he raised his eyes from the jewel and moved deliberately to where Her Majesty was standing, and with a deferential reverence placed in her hand the famous diamond, with the words, "It is to me, ma'am, the greatest pleasure thus to have the opportunity, as a loyal subject, of myself tendering to my sovereign, the Koh-i-nur." When Dalhousie later heard about the incident, he was livid that Duleep had taken credit for giving the stone to Victoria, because, as I've said, he was determined to take credit for this. In later life, Duleep Singh reneged on his statement though, saying that he wanted the stone back and that it had been stolen, but as we know, he never got it. Instead, it was retained by Victoria, and when she died, it was inherited by her descendants as part of the British crown jewels. It was set into the Queen Consort's crown for Queen Alexandra, wife of Edward VII, then into the crowns of Queen Mary in 1911 and Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, in 1937, where it remains to this day in the Jewel House in the Tower of London. Even if it is not cursed, however, it is controversial, largely because of the way in which it came into the hands of the British. And to finish the video, I'm going to briefly look at the competing claims of several other countries who argue that it is rightfully theirs and should be given back to them. First up, we have India. The diamond ultimately originated in that country and has been owned by a number of Indian rulers and Sikh Maharajas, as we've seen in this video, right down to Duleep Singh. Now, there's no doubt in my mind that the way in which it was taken from him was very dubious indeed, given his youth and the duress put on him to surrender it, and even commentators at the time, including in the Times newspaper, had qualms about the legality of its seizure. As Lena Logan's description of the last time Duleep saw the stone suggests, even when he handed it back to Victoria, and he was still only a teenager at that point, remember, it seemed to take an emotional toll on him, and as noted, he declared that he wanted it back in later life. Does that mean that it should go back to India, though, which has asked for its return numerous times since gaining independence in 1947? The lands Duleep ruled over in the 1840s are not all in modern-day India, and in fact he was born and based in what is now the Pakistani city of Lahore, giving that country a potential claim. The stone hasn't actually been on modern-day Indian soil since 1739, when, as we've seen, it was taken by Nadir Shah, who was a leader in both Persia, that's modern-day Iran, and Afghanistan. This has led some to argue that one of these countries should own it, as have the many decades it spent on Afghan soil. Both Pakistan and Afghanistan have, like India, asked for the stone over the years. However, British Prime Ministers have always refused and said it will remain in the UK. When asked about it in 2010, for example, the then PM David Cameron said, "If you say yes to one, you suddenly find the British Museum would be empty. It is going to have to stay put." So to sum up, the core argument for continued British ownership is that it was obtained through the Treaty of Lahore, and that its history is so messy it's impossible to settle on an alternate owner. One could also point to Duleep Singh's comment as a teenager that he was giving it to Queen Victoria, though I think relying on the words of a dispossessed minor is quite shaky. The diamond has a complicated history, and I think it's unlikely there will ever be a consensus around the world about where it belongs. The prospect of it staying in the UK is unpalatable to many Indians though, as its seizure is seen as one of the many colonial wounds inflicted upon the country, and the dispute around its future ownership and use has not abated with time. In October 2022, there was speculation in some news outlets around the world that it would not be used in the coronation of Queen Camilla, to avoid inflaming tensions between the two countries. A spokesperson for the Indian Prime Minister said that the coronation of Camilla and the use of the crown jewel Koh-i-nur brings back painful memories of the colonial past. However, as of the creation of this video, it remains to be seen whether she will wear the diamond or not, and this is one argument with no end in sight. I hope you've enjoyed this look at one of the world's most famous diamonds. Thank you as always to my wonderful patrons for their generous support of the channel, and if you'd like to join them and get access to some additional perks, check out the link in the description box below. Thank you too to those of you who support the channel with one-off payments using the thanks button below videos. Let me know below which country you think should possess the Koh-i-nur now, and until next week, keep learning.